Hello, this is Patrick Halstead at Qdabra Software, and this is a short presentation on automating business processes with InfoPath and SharePoint. We'll talk about how you can use InfoPath and SharePoint to enable real-world scenarios, large-scale scenarios, and we'll talk about how to do that with our Qdabra web services. First of all, to start off with, InfoPath was created in 2003. Before InfoPath, you had a diverse range of ways to collect input: Word, email, Notepad, Excel, lots of different ways to collect data. And the problem is that none of these were consistent. In fact, oftentimes people would connect with email and send information. They would not be able to take that information and input it into their business process. With InfoPath on the scenes in 2003, now you have one generic, consistent mechanism for collecting data and sharing it across your organization. So it improves efficiency. Consistency obviously reduces the amount of work required to create these solutions, because you don't have to create custom Word solutions that you deploy on the client. You can deploy this to SharePoint. And the key element here in InfoPath is the support for XML, which is the lingua franca of business process languages on the internet. Very similar to how HTML is the language of web pages, XML is the language of your business process. It allows you to quickly create electronic forms that stream to your business services on the internet, whether that be your application server or any of your other line of business applications. So InfoPath has broad applicability. InfoPath was designed not only to meet the needs of small teams, which typically have ad hoc requirements, very loosely coupled form input needs. For example, the weekly status form, where you're actually sharing your status amongst your team members. You don't need to really worry about reporting on that data, and you don't have high requirements for validating it. And this is towards the low end, low number of team members and a very ad hoc process. On the high end, you've got large enterprises, several thousands, if not tens of thousands of employees collecting information, and it's a more formalized process, so there could be workflows. There could be other approval-based processes that need to happen to make sure the data is valid. Now, InfoPath gives you, in 2010, the ability to create electronic forms which can be web forms. And it is better than other applications out there today because it supports very rich forms. You've got validation in the form. You can write logic to validate your fields. You've got, of course, things like spell checking, autocorrect, all the things you expect in Word, in Office. And you've also got pattern matching and business logic using rules. So it exceeds, it's much more deep than, say, for example, the other form building tools on the internet today. You look at competitors like Wufoo or PDF Forms, and it really exceeds the abilities of those applications because of the rich and deep logic that can be used. And it's all, of course, codeless. And designers can use the form to create very specific data collection functionality. So it's also a web client, and in that business processes today are on the web. And InfoPath paves that last mile to the proverbial data collection doorstep. And the reason why it allows you to create generic applications for data collection is because InfoPath is an XML client. So it allows you to take any business process out there today and create an InfoPath form from it quickly by taking the XML or the XML definition from the internet and creating a form around it. And out of the box, it comes with XML validation, which means that you do not have to worry about verifying the data after it's been submitted. The InfoPath form will only submit data that is valid according to that XML structure, and that means that you don't have to worry about hiring a developer to do validation on the back end. Your data, when it's submitted, it's good. And it's the only application today that actually does that. Word, Excel, PDF forms, Wufoo, whatever. They don't guarantee a contract of XML validation on the client. And this is the client, with InfoPath, the client can be either the InfoPath client, the filler form, which runs as a rich client on Windows, or it can be the browser form, which can run on any operating system. The third point that enables these web forms is the data connections. InfoPath, because it's an XML-based technology, it can connect to web services without the need for writing code. So it'll connect to SOAP-based web service, REST-based web services, and read data from those web services to help you pre-populate your form, look up information, pull that information into your form. You can also submit information to SOAP-based web services. It's very powerful when connecting to web clients, Web 2.0 servers, anything that's running in the cloud that needs that structure, and that's a huge value add. However, InfoPath can have some limitations, specifically around database support. InfoPath can, of course, create a database-backed form, but it will not work in the browser. So InfoPath needs some kind of a web service to connect the browser forms to the database. In addition, with the database, you cannot parameterize queries. What does that mean? It means that you cannot connect to a database and query the database using a field from your form. You have to actually hard code the query. So that's a big limitation. In addition, while you can connect to SharePoint data connections to use a list or a library to pre-populate your drop-downs or to pull data into your form, because SharePoint's native functionality it uses a protocol stack which is slow, and that's the DAV protocol stack. Because of that, the data connections to SharePoint can be slow, and there's no easy way to connect to your SharePoint server and pull the data down into your form in a performant way. So those are two limitations in the InfoPath technology today. Most businesses need these following things today. There's a need among businesses, small and large, for lower cost to maintain solutions. So the idea is to reduce the custom code, reduce the amount of dependency on developers, but while doing that, retain scalability. You need to be able to plan for the future without creating a solution that's going to break today. You need to have a scalable platform, a scalable architecture, and you need to comply with policy. There's governance, obviously, regulations, and compliance that you need to comply with. And that means you need to audit the workflow, you need to audit the business process, you need to look at who has permissions to do these different actions, you need to make sure you're keeping track of who does what. And you need to report on what the status of your process is. What is the current number of overdue items? Are you complying with the procedures you put in place, with the policies you're trying to meet? And you also want to make sure that you can make changes without having to bring the system down. So every business process will go through evolution. Once you've deployed an electronic forms business process, you're going to realize a lot of benefits, and one of those benefits is that you'll see things down the road that you want to do. So after deploying your initial solution, you're going to want to upgrade it and change it to meet the needs of your new perspective, your new business model. And you want to do that without having to change the solution in a way that will incur cost. You also want to do it in a way that will reduce the amount of downtime. And finally, these systems that you deploy with InfoPath and SharePoint typically gather data, and there's a need to connect that data to the line of business applications that you already have, whether they be a database or some kind of a web service. You need to be able to push that data to those line of business applications. So these are your business needs today. Now SharePoint is a huge benefit with business process automation. It allows for seamless deployment of InfoPath Forms. You can attach workflows to those forms. You can do versioning control. You can create dashboards with KPIs. However, just as InfoPath is limited, SharePoint has scalability issues around items in lists or libraries. Typically, Microsoft says 5,000 items in 2010, but in reality may be a little bit higher. However, you've still got a limit, whether it be 20,000 or 50,000. There's a time when your business process, if it's a business process that gathers a lot of data, will need to move the data to some other place, some other storage site. Typically that's going to be a SQL database. In addition, the libraries and lists are flat tables. In SharePoint, you don't have a very easy way to report on repeating data, and you can't search data that's encapsulated in your XML forms. So Microsoft usually recommends, in fact their guidance on their website is that if InfoPath is the premier web services client because it speaks XML. It is the client that you need to adopt for your web services. However, they do not provide the web service. And this web service is what you would use to connect to SharePoint, to SQL, to any line of business application. Now, SharePoint out of the box comes with a set of web services, but they aren't submit web services. 2013 comes with REST-based web services. However, these REST-based web services do not support submit. So you can read all the data and you can use the data to pre-populate your form, but it's very difficult to move the data into SharePoint or into a database without writing your own web service. And so people do that. People write their own web service. In fact, that's the best practice when you're trying to connect to a database. The problem with the database, and the reason why it's not a best practice, is because when you connect an InfoPath form to a database, you're inheriting the data types and the structure from the database. The database is a relational structure. InfoPath supports XML, which is a hierarchical structure. The hierarchical structure is a more advanced, a richer representation than relational databases. This may not be obvious to some people, but the XML data structure is actually an ontological representation versus the relational one. So an XML data structure is inherently a superset of what you can do with a database. So by connecting to a database, you're essentially limiting the functionality that is built into InfoPath. And that is not only on the structural side, but it's also on the data type side. For example, images, rich text cannot be represented in a database without doing a bunch of custom code. In addition, I think the main limitation here is that when you're connecting to a database directly, if you're using the InfoPath filler, it works just fine because the filler authenticates the user. The user's credentials are passed to the database. The form itself will pass some kind of a SQL password or some kind of a Windows authentication password to the database, and if the user has access, then they can query the tables. When you're running the form in the browser, the user will connect to SharePoint, they'll render the form, but the browser will not forward the credentials to SQL, which means that you do not have access to a database, and that whole scenario of connecting directly to the database does not work. So for browser-based forms, and by browser-based forms I mean InfoPath Form Services, that's IPFS, web forms, those forms will not work with a direct connection to a database, and you will need to use a web service. And that's the prescriptive guidance from Microsoft. So most companies out there today create web services. And this is fine and dandy, except for the fact that you end up creating one web service per InfoPath form template. And that means you've got, well, you might start off with a few, but over time, many of your business processes will move to SharePoint and to InfoPath. You'll have hundreds of form templates, and therefore you'll have hundreds of web services, and this becomes a huge maintenance issue. So we recommend creating one web service that will take any InfoPath form template and map it to a SQL database. And that's what our web service does. It's a generic web service. It allows you to take any InfoPath form template and map it to the database. The web service itself allows for this loosely coupled mapping, but it uses a data-driven approach. You load the mapping from XML to SQL, and it then takes the XML document, it stores the XML document in the database, and then it maps it out to those tables that you've defined in the mapping. Just a quick demo here. When you install the DBXL web service, you'll get this home page. This is your admin page. And typically you'll start with the admin tool, and this will let you create and configure your mappings from InfoPath to your database and to SharePoint. Now DBXL, the web service that we provide, was developed starting in 2004, and Qdabra was, of course, we started off our existence because we saw that there was a need to help Microsoft evangelize InfoPath and SharePoint technologies, and so we started working with customers to deploy InfoPath solutions, and those customers in the early days were mostly Microsoft. Microsoft was the early adopter of its own technology, and so we started working at Microsoft to help them take InfoPath and SharePoint and build these large-scale solutions. And the first gap that was apparent was the fact that there's no way to report on data in a repeating section in InfoPath. So we created this web service back in 2004 for Microsoft and for a couple other customers that were outside of Microsoft. And we've been slowly adding features to it. Back in the early days, we had a couple web services and 30 or 40 different web methods. Nowadays, DBXL 2.6 and now 2.7, releasing soon, contains over 10 web services and over 200 web methods. And this is the admin tool. What you see here is this is my my training site. I have a couple of demo forms here. Each row in this admin tool corresponds to an InfoPath form template. So we have a grouping here for my demos. My name is Patrick, obviously. We've got a grouping for two demonstrations here, my sample form with suggestions and the suggestion itself. I've also got some training forms for versioning. I'm showing a new version of a form, showing how to version between the old and the new. But what I want to show you today is the expense report form. This comes pre-installed with every DBXL installation. And if we click on the edit button, and this, of course, is an InfoPath form. We're using InfoPath as our tool to configure the web service. The general tab here shows you the name of the InfoPath form template. We can specify a solution group here. We can click on this button here to type in a new group, or we can select from the existing groups. We've got a description field which has not been added, and we've got the actual form XSN template. This is the XML solution XSN, which represents the InfoPath form. When you save an InfoPath form from the InfoPath Designer, you get an XSN format file, and this is what you'll attach here. And you can see I've attached version 4, and this is the URL that I get. Now the tool specifies the mapping to the database, and here you see the mapping tab. And here we have the table on the left. This is the SQL table, and the InfoPath form on the right. So we've got a lot of tables in this database. You can see we've got probably about 40, 50 tables. We're mapping to a specific one. In this case, it's going to be the expense report table. So I can use this tool to connect, basically define a mapping from my InfoPath form XML on the right to my database mapping on the left. And you can see that when I specify the mapping, it automatically infers the database type, and that uses that to assist with the mapping. You will need to define a primary key that you're using to specify the uniqueness of the row in the database table. You can see here that one of the main benefits of the mapping is the ability to support parent-child. This is there's a support for arbitrarily deep table structures, unlike SharePoint list forms or SharePoint library forms, which have a flat table. With our tool, you can actually have a relational database in your SQL database that has any number of table depth. So you could have a grandparent, you could have a parent, a child, a grandchild. You could have any number of child tables here. And you can see that in this example, QD expense report is the parent, and QD expense report employee, and QD expense report item, and QD expense report manager are the children. And so we have this ability to define these parent-child relationships and so on at an arbitrary depth. When we create a parent-child relationship, we do have to specify the foreign key, and this is a key in the database, so that both the left side and the right side point to keys. Otherwise, the mapping of the columns to the InfoPath form is just an InfoPath form XML path, that's an XPath, mapping to the SQL database table column on the left. And so what you'll do is you'll select these database columns, and then you'll select the nodes, and that's how you will specify your mapping. Now the nice thing about the mapping is that you can change it on the fly, because we always store the InfoPath XML form in addition to the mapping. And that enables you to go back after the fact, update your database, update your InfoPath form template, and you can change the mapping and it doesn't interrupt the process. So in other words, people can continue to edit their forms and submit them. They do not need to wait on a Friday afternoon while you update the server. There's no interruption of the submit process. So let's take a look at a very simple sample here. I've got in this library here this expense report sample, and what I'm going to do is open this form and show you this form. So I've already attached it to the web service, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to save it out to my local machine. I'm just going to save it to my desktop. And then what I'm going to do is use the InfoPath Designer to open the expense report on my desktop and show you the form. Now this form is the 2007 InfoPath expense report form, and we have modified this form to work with 2010. We've set the compatibility settings to 2010 here, web browser form. Okay, and we have a submit button in the form, and the submit button is submitting the data to the web service. You can see here the web service has been defined, and if we look at the web service, the web service, this is once again a data-driven approach. We are specifying the XML as the entire InfoPath form. So the web service is going to handle mapping the XML to the relational database, and we're just going to pass the web service the entire data. We have some metadata here for the name, the author, and the description, which was specified. That data will be persisted as metadata when we submit the form. So that's pretty much all there is. This is a stock InfoPath 2007 form, which has been upgraded to 2010 web browser. And we'll just save it out here to our desktop with the 2010 web browser settings. We'll remove it and reattach it and save it. Now, before I save it, what I want to do is I want to specify a SharePoint mapping, and you can see I've already done that, but I have two mappings for my form. I have a mapping to a SharePoint library called ER 2010 V2, that's for ER for expense report, and I have another one for ER 2010 V3. Now this shows you the power of the web service. The web service, not only does it map the data to your SQL database, but it also allows you to conditionally map forms to one or more form libraries. And this is very powerful, for example, if you have different departments or different groups you need to map a form based on some data in the form. In this case, we're looking at the purpose of the expense report. And if the purpose is training, we're going to map it to V3. If the purpose isn't something else, we'll map it to V2. And so we'll just save this out, this mapping out. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the form from SharePoint. So the web service is essentially the gatekeeper between the form and the database, in addition to the SharePoint server. Now, because it's a gatekeeper, it can control permissions. We'll take a look at that in a second. But it can also allow you to route forms to the database or to SharePoint conditionally. So, for example, you may have some kind of status in your form. You don't want to map it out to your SQL database tables until it's been approved. You can do a conditional mapping to the database just like we've done this conditional mapping in SharePoint here with these expressions. Okay, so we haven't touched the server in a while, so it took a little longer than expected to refresh that. But let's take a look at the SharePoint site here. I've got my training site. I just got back from Australia, so I've got my auformsword.com training site here, which I'm going to enter. As you can see here, I have a form library in SharePoint 2010, and I can click on the Add button, and I can add a document to the form library. Now, the document has the submit in it, so this is the ER form that we just published, and we're going to call this demo, and we'll just type in some information here. I'm your demo monkey today. My manager's name is Janice. And get her email correct here. That's the only required field in the form. We could, of course, extend the form to add more, but this is just the stock form that we've used. And let's just say that we're going to expense our Starbucks coffee here. And we'll call that morale. And while we're at it, we'll add the GoToMeeting expense. I don't know if we have a GoToMeeting license, but let's just say we're doing it pay-as-you-go. We'll call it an office expense, and we'll just say it's $10 for this demo. Okay, and I'll submit this form. Now, this form is being submitted to the web service, and because the purpose of the expense was not training, you'll see that it appears here. Now, the name of the form is the date which I submitted. You can, of course, change that. That's just metadata. We can open this up, and we can change this. Let's change the GoToMeeting cost to $12, and we'll change the Starbucks to $3.99. And we'll submit again. Of course, we can attach receipts. We can do more. Okay, so there's the form right there. We've just submitted it to the web service. The web service went ahead and submitted it not only to the database but also to SharePoint. Let's take a look at that database. In order to look at the database, we will need to connect to it. So we're going to use our SQL Server Management Studio application to connect to the database. Now, this is a database living on our... And the database could exist on SQL Azure. It could exist on your local computer. It could also exist on the some kind of a VPN. So we're going to use the VPN version for this demo here. It's going to connect to the VPN first, and you can't see this because it's in a different window. Once that's finished, I will connect to the web service here. I'm going to pick the web service for that site, and we should see that the SQL database come up here with the various options. Okay, so here's our database. Here's our SQL server with the various databases. And for this demo, we're using the our utility database installed on our au.formsboard.com site. So if I drill down into these tables, you can see that DBXL web service installs two system databases, the Qdabra DBXL and the Qdabra utility. And in this case, it installs this sample form for you to test with, and it includes these four tables: expense report employee, the report item, and the report manager. So we're going to take a look at these two tables here. We're going to open up the expense report and the expense report item, show you the tables and you can see here, there's my demo item for the main table. I scroll over and I can see that indeed that was the one I just added. $15.99 is the total. I can also look at my items here, and I can look at the top items there, and you can see that the top items that we've just added are the Starbucks $3.99 and the go-to meeting. So we've been able to map the database to the parent table as well as the child table, and of course if we go into the form and edit the form and change that Starbucks value, let's just add a new value. And we'll just say this is a we'll say it's a flight. Let's say Alaska Air. Let's say the demo was in San Francisco and I had to take a plane there, and the plane was $175. And we'll change the Starbucks to the San Francisco price of $6.99. Just kidding. And we submit it out. Okay, we go back to our database and hit the refresh, and we'll see those values quickly get submitted to the database. So it's very fast. We're using a SOAP web service to connect to the database, to connect to the web service, and that SOAP web service is much faster than submitting to a SharePoint library. It's about 8 times faster. So you can see that from the browser form. It was pretty much instantaneous. Now, we also have the ability to map to multiple SharePoint sites. Now you notice that if I have a rule in my admin tool that says if the purpose is training, I want to map it to a separate library. So when I submit this with training, you'll notice it disappears from this library. But if I go up and change my SharePoint library to the V3 version, you'll see that it now appears there, and that's the same form that I just edited. Okay. So the web service is not only is the web service mapping to the SQL database, that's the key benefit, but it's also allowing us to map to multiple SharePoint libraries. So I'm going to go back to my demonstration real quick here. And I think that the key point in this quick presentation here is to really talk about the features that we've provided. Not only have we provided these features that enable mapping to the database, mapping to SharePoint site, but we've also provided the ability to configure it on the fly using our admin tool. We have a bunch of tools in addition to the admin tool, which is in the center here. We have tools to allow you to create queries. So for example, I can show you a query on that data, and I have a form that I've developed, a very simple form that shows this very well here. Let me just go to that form real quick. So InfoPath is a great tool for connecting to web services, so why not use InfoPath as our simple reporting tool? Yes, good idea. So we'll take a look at this here and show you this form that I've created. And this is just a really simple form that I created. You see here that the form has a drop-down box here. It's going to query that data that I just submitted for the expense report, and it's going to show the details. So we'll preview the form. The preview is going to connect to the web service and get the purposes of the expenses. You can see that one of those purposes is this training here, and that purpose is the last one I added. Actually, that's different. So the web service here is connected to a different server. Let's just take a look at that. So here's how you would configure it. You would just basically map it to the database using your web service. And we have a method called the QueryDB web service that that has a bunch of methods underneath it. One of those methods is get columns for XML strings, and that method allows you to pull data from your database table into your form. So we'll take a quick look at this. And here you can see that we're pulling in data from this table, and the table is the training table. So we're pulling in from a different table. We really want to use the auformswar.com table for a utility database. The same here. So we'll just change this. This is a string. This the sample value for the query is actually something that you can use our tool to create. You don't have to remember the syntax or anything. You can use our query builder tool to create this. And we'll do the same thing for our expenses, because we need to make sure the expenses follow the same database format. And here, this one actually has been correctly enabled. Just verify that. Now notice that we're not calling the get expenses on load, we're only calling get to purposes. So now when I preview this, you'll see that the actual purposes are those, just the training one that I have here. Now when it selects training, it should be querying the database and displaying the values. It's not doing that. There's some problem in my form. Let's see if we can figure this out. So we have a rule in our form, and this is basically how you're going to set this up. Is you're going to have a rule. When the drop-down changes, you're going to set the query value, and no doubt this is the problem here, is that we're setting it still equal to training, and we need to set equal to the new database. And then preview it again, and let's just see if this fixed the issue. So here we've got our data from the demo, the expensive San Francisco Starbucks, the GoToMeeting, and then the transportation. And so you can definitely easily create a form that queries your database using parameters, and you can dynamically set those parameters to query. This is something that you don't get out of the box in InfoPath. So what I've shown you today is I've shown you a couple things. I've shown you ways to work around the limits in InfoPath and SharePoint that enable these scenarios. So specifically, InfoPath is this great web forms technology. However, it does have a limitation around connecting to the database for browser-based forms and for parameterizing those queries when you're querying a database. So we've just showed you that we can create a browser form that submits data to a database using our web service, and we've showed you how fast that is. It's very fast to submit the forms. In addition, the SharePoint limitation, once you get above 5, 10, 20,000 items, you're going to need to store the data in the database. For performance reasons, we obviously didn't show you 10,000 items, but if you can definitely submit hundreds of thousands, millions of items to the database and use the DataView web part to show those items on your screen. What we have shown is the ability to report on repeating data. So because we're storing the data in the database in a relational fashion, you can use a SQL report, you can use an InfoPath form, you can use any kind of technology, like Excel for example, to pull the data out and show the pivot of the children against the parent, or however you want to do it. So it's not limited like these SharePoint libraries to this flat property promotion. You can actually get all the data out. And you can search on the data. I didn't show this last item, but you can do that as well. So that's my quick 40-minute demo for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send an email to support@qdabra.com, and we look forward to hearing from you. And thank you very much.